Welcome back to Wicked Problems. I'm Richard Delavan.
I think for some areas of our life, we're maybe okay if some private company like Google, Facebook decides how these values are embedded in the algorithms that we're using. But for electricity, water, traffic, like really fundamental resources that people need for daily life, maybe we really wouldn't want a private company to take these decisions. Many things are being automated just because of what you just said. It's too complex. Like the systems we're building, like the infrastructure systems, are so large scale. No human operator can in real time take these decisions. So rather than waiting for these decisions being made for us, I do think it's a great point in time to think about what we actually want.
Well, look, we're going to get a bit wonky, but hopefully not too preachy. Although I'm dressed in my in honor of Steve Bannon, multi-layered, several things going on in the garden because it's very cold today here in England. But AI, going through an inflection point in the hype cycle. Scrappy Chinese startup DeepSeek claimed to produce an AI model as good as anything made by Meta or OpenAI, but for a tiny fraction of the computing power, which might be bad news for tech bros who convince themselves and their shareholders and investors that worked so well for 1970s Detroit. People just want more muscle cars, none of these cheap and scrappy vehicles, thank you. Was just what the tech sector needs to dominate China and the world. And I'm going to allow myself some time to drink in the Schadenfreude at the expense of Elon Musk et al. And it is delicious. I am also not going to pretend that AI is going away. Like nuclear weapons, AI might be the kind of thing we wished we could uninvent. Certainly, listening to the godfather of AI, Geoffrey Hinton, talk to Andrew Marr, you do wonder.
Suppose there's several different superintelligences, and they all realize that the more data centers they control, the smarter they'll get, because the more data they can process. Suppose one of them just has a slight desire to have more copies of itself. You can see what's going to happen next. They're going to end up competing, and we're going to end up with superintelligences with all the nasty properties that people have that depended on us having evolved from small bands of warring chimpanzees, or our common ancestors with chimpanzees. And that leads to intense loyalty within the group, desires for strong leaders, willingness to do in people outside the group. And if you get evolution between superintelligences, you'll get all those things.
You're talking about them, Professor Hinton, as if they have full consciousness. Now, all the way through the development of computers and AI, people have talked about consciousness. Do you think that the consciousness has perhaps already arrived inside AI?
Yes, I do.
Hinton didn't actually finish the interview saying, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," but then it's possible Oppenheimer at Los Alamos didn't actually say that either. And that's before we get to the killer robots. In September, Nature published some disturbing research led by Colin Holbrook at the Department of Cognitive and Information Sciences at the University of California at Merced. He studied how willing people were to trust an AI in life or death situations by putting test subjects in the role of drone controllers, like some CIA drone jockey or people on both sides in Ukraine, or these people were presented to these test subjects with visual data that asked them to identify which were enemy targets and which were allied positions. They then had to decide whether to fire missiles and kill the people at the target. Then a robot, literally one experiment had a humanoid robot rather than a disembodied AI, told them whether it agreed or not with the decision to fire. In situations where the AI disagreed with the designation, friend or foe, the human subject changed their mind 2/3 of the time. And when the AI agreed with them, they stuck with their initial decision nearly 100% of the time. Only one problem. The agree-disagree advice was completely random. So loads of surveys showing levels of discomfort with giving AI control over things. Interestingly, younger people tend to be less trusting of AI than older respondents. But revealed preference is everything. And if we're honest, that's kind of scary because it feels inevitable. I live southeast of London. My wife's parents who are elderly live in Devon, which is a ways away. And on a good day, in the middle of the night with no construction, you can get there in about 4 hours. On a bad day, because someone really can't avoid staring at Stonehenge on the A303 and rear end someone in front of them doing the same thing, it can take 7 hours. I know the way to get to my in-laws, but I keep Google Maps on the whole time now because it tells me to divert and avoid traffic if we can. And let's say if one of my in-laws is in hospital, I'm going to take the advice and potentially shave an hour or more off my journey. So it's not killer robots, but as the stakes go up, you want to feel like you did everything you could to not get it wrong. And usually that means paying attention to what the machine tells you should be doing, which intuitively I understand like why that's sounds awful when you say it out loud. And yet, as Geoffrey Hinton goes on to say in the interview, the reason we're going ahead on all this stuff with AI is because in the short term, it's impossible to ignore the benefits. Never mind traffic, but health, education, materials design. This morning, I woke up to stories of self-healing asphalt that can actually stop potholes. It uses tiny spores. I swear to God, that's what they call it. Filled with used cooking oil, which is added to the mix in the asphalt, which prevents micro cracks from getting bigger as the oil is released during freeze-thaw cycles. Again, I'll link to the piece, but the project was possible thanks to a collaboration between scientists at King's College London, Swansea University in Wales and Chile, and in Google. Because, as Google's blog post this morning reports, and glowing endorsements from the researchers, the apparent breakthrough, which could be a huge solve, not just for car repair, but reducing carbon emissions through extending the life of roads, tires, etc., would not have been possible without the AI contained in the Google Cloud that they were using. Like that, most AI things fall in the middle, right? Between killer robots and things that don't matter at all. Perhaps none more important than the role AI and automation are playing in energy. Not the electricity demand problem. That's why the DeepSeek thing is so interesting, and finding out whether it's true could be huge news, and is huge news. But on electricity supply, and more importantly, the power grids, switching on and off solar, wind, batteries, geothermal versus natural gas or coal, or determining which demand sources, whether they be a data center or your car charging or a heat pump or whatever, get switched on and off at particular times. These are decisions that you just, like, no one person can make in real time. Some dude sitting in a control room somewhere. That's just not reality. And if things get out of whack between supply and demand on a power grid, the frequency of power gets a little bit messed up. You get blackouts, and or worse, you get equipment blowing up, literally blowing up. And that could take weeks to repair. And as we see more storms like the one that's kept tens of thousands of Irish people in the dark more than a week, or fires in Los Angeles requiring electricity to be turned off to prevent more power lines shorting out and starting even more fires, this is the stuff real people depend on just to get through a day, and it's coming under more stress. And we are automating those decisions more and more to prevent bad outcomes, or as we see them. So they kind of have to be. And what we usually forget is that every algorithm reflects the values and priorities of the people who wrote it, like which ones get turned back on first, who gets turned off first, which community gets hit hardest by deciding whether to reroute power through one thing. So paying attention to those values and priorities that are like baked into whoever wrote the algorithm seems more important than ever. Even if not everyone is convinced that the concern from people like Elon or Zuck is sincere. Ask Frankie McNamara.
With no more social issues to conquer, the only problem left for tech bros to solve is the problem of ethics. Tech bros care deeply about the ethics of AI, which is just another way of asking, how evil can we get without anyone noticing it? So rather than making AI more ethical, they just talk about wanting to make AI more ethical, which is basically the same thing as long as you're not affected by it.
Do you know Frankie? If you don't, well, link the show notes and more clips of that at the end, because my God, we need a bit of a laugh right now. One person who is definitely sincere in her concern about ensuring these systems come to fair outcomes, who is 10x smarter than me and can communicate the stakes as plainly as Geoffrey Hinton, is Sophie Hall, a researcher at ETH University in Zurich. And she kindly spoke to me right before the DeepSeek news, but I think that news and other events since make her point even more important. Coming up with ways to make these systems consider fairness and justice in the outcomes they are optimizing for is more important and more urgent than ever. Because otherwise, it's going to be guys like Elon Musk, who Americans woke up to yesterday to find out he and his minions have access to the payment system, distributing $6 trillion in federal spending every year, along with everyone's social security number, the medical history of a third of the U.S. population, and every transaction with every global aid agency, NGO, government contractor, and other government around the world. And with that data, train his own AIs. Well, I'm sure that'll work out just fine. If you're enjoying these conversations, please do subscribe to wickedproblems.earth and help us out, if you can, with some material support so we can keep the lights on, keep the dogs in kibble, and plug in my hybrid charged for the next trip down the A303, guided by Google. And please don't make me beg, but a rating and review on Spotify or Apple or YouTube really does help people find the show, and we would appreciate it. Now here's my conversation. Welcome back to Wicked Problems. I am Richard Delavan, and I'm so delighted we could be joined today by PhD student in control theory at ETH Zurich, Sophie Hall. Sophie, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite.
And I suppose it's a bit of a kind of a complicated thing to get into, but maybe the easiest way for me to start is to ask you maybe to introduce yourself a little bit, and like your line of research and what you're working on.
Okay. Yeah, of course. So myself, I grew up in Germany. I did my undergrad in the UK, actually. Then I moved to Singapore for a year abroad, studied there for a while. And then I started my master's at ETH Zurich in control, focusing on control and electrical engineering and technologies in that area. And then I continued it with a PhD. And since then, I've been working on specifically what we call like dynamic resource allocation problems, or developing control algorithms that can handle resource scarcity in the future and ensure that whatever algorithms we're implementing, that they're explainable and have certain certificates and properties that we would like them to have. And that's what I'm focusing on in my PhD. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, and that's, I think one of the reasons that we wanted to ask you on is because you published something at the end of last year, kind of the applicability of some of this work that you're doing, to systems that are involved and affected by, the impacts of climate change. And I think you cited in a blog post that you'd written, the kind of double whammy of hurricanes in North Carolina and Tennessee. Since then, sadly, the world has continued to provide more examples of extreme events in Los Angeles. The city is still burning. Here in the UK, we are experiencing, I've just heard of an MP on the floor of Parliament refer to it as a weather bomb. Mm-hmm. With the entirety of the island of Ireland under a red warning of danger to life for going outside with record winds, storms that, again, no record of which is anything this powerful having come ashore before. So, yeah, kind of bad stuff. And the people that get affected most by these events, as you pointed out in your work, are generally people who have the least resilience due to financial and economic circumstances. Many other researchers have done that. So just to maybe explain, first of all, why did you decide to work, again, you could work in control theory and presumably make a lot of money in robotics, make a lot of money working on self-driving cars. But this, your work has a kind of a heart to it in, concerns about justice that are again, perhaps not the ones that we top of mind, say for Elon Musk or someone else doing self-driving cars. So maybe tell me, why did you decide to focus on some of these challenges as opposed to, some other areas of interest and endeavor?
So I guess the simple and fast answer is that I really think that these problems are being overlooked to some degree in the research community, and we are getting there. There's more and more interest in like fairness and control algorithms over time now. But especially when I started looking into this, there wasn't as much attention for the topic. And I also feel like the general public is overlooking that a little bit. And let me start with an example of like something that really was is striking, I think, is that there are these, right, if we take the example of electricity, many people would consider is like a human right to have access to electricity, and this is how it's implemented in the Western world. But now if we see actually in, for example, the United States, that with climate change, we have a rising number of outages, and there's an aging grid, and there's ever more demand for electricity. And these factors combined actually lead to really prolonged outages that happened over the past years. And those outages are actually not distributed equally across like socioeconomic classes in the United States. For example, there are studies that show that if your socioeconomic impact factor drops, which is like a metric defined by the CDC in the United States, by 10%, that might lead to an average of around 30% more outage times. So that's when they measure like how long does it take you to get reconnected to the grid. And the issue with that is not only that, of course, it's annoying to not have electricity for longer, but actually for like disadvantaged communities, that can have severe health effects, because many of these people in the communities, they might rely on either like medical equipment that requires constant electricity supply, or they might have less like good infrastructure for cooling or heating, or their housing might be older, or they might be subject to like chronic diseases because they're sometimes older on average, these communities. And yeah, so I would say designing like resilient infrastructure systems is important once that we avoid outages in the first place, and making them more robust. And secondly, that then if we design them, that we also make sure that cutting resources in certain instances affects people like not disproportionately across the state.
We see examples of this all the time, unfortunately, in the US particularly, where people forget that the grid is a public good, right? Mm-hmm. And the idea that there is a requirement to not just things aren't going to happen automatically. And so, in Houston, I can't remember which hurricane because there's just too many now, where it, during a particularly hot month in August, it took weeks and weeks for a lot of folks to be reconnected, which meant that they didn't have access to air conditioning and cooling, which meant that, again, the health effects have been documented there. And we're seeing in places like Pakistan, the growth of rooftop solar, being the third biggest market in the world now for solar PV in Pakistan, because of the fact that the grid has become so unreliable that, if you need access to cooling, that you're going to have to take care of yourself, which, again, for those people who can afford it, they're going ahead. But for those people who can't, they're left behind. So I suppose it's first and foremost, you're making an argument about, the grid as public good, and the idea that access to electricity is if not a human right, then certainly very, very important. And then in terms of how we decide how these things are allocated and where resources are put, that seems to be the heart of kind of what you're doing that's novel, is applying different kind of theoretic, kind of constructs, particularly game theory, to how you make these systems different. So in the simplest possible terms, for a bare small brain like myself, can you try to explain, as you did a great job in that video and your blog post, kind of what you're doing that's different and how it helps to improve outcomes of fairness in these resource allocation questions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So I think if we talk about game theory, it is really like this field that was invented to deal with questions of conflict and cooperation between individuals, and getting different solution concepts and reasoning about the outcomes in a theoretical manner, given certain metrics that we're defining, like fairness metrics or something like along those lines. And then now I think in my research, what is special is that I'm combining game theory with one very advanced control technology that can actually handle these large-scale infrastructure systems that we were talking about. So let's say the electricity grid, or water distribution systems, traffic networks, like any sort of system that humans actually access and they interact with that system. So we call them like socio-technical systems. And then in the end, like the control algorithm actually represents a human being or the interests of a human being. And that then needs to be taken into account when we design these algorithms, that behind it, there's actually an individual. Like if we, for example, automate the energy usage in your household, then you as an individual have certain interests, right? And then that should be taken into account. But at the same time, right, we need an algorithm that can actually deal with what we call the physical dynamics of your battery, for example. Let's say you charge a battery at home. You need to take into account how that battery state evolves over time. We want to predict into the future. We want to take into account like the limits of the battery, for example. Like how much can you even charge it within 1 hour? How do you not damage this infrastructure? And then now I think the special or novel part about my research is really combining these two things, like advanced control algorithms with game theoretical arguments about like fairness and self-interested users. Yeah.
And so for a lot of lay people, they would have, when they hear game theory, they might be thinking of the classic kind of Cold War nuclear strategy, game of chicken, which is often the crude analogy that's used of like two cars that are driving toward each other and figuring out who's going to swerve first, in other kind of ways of thinking about things like the prisoner's dilemma. But I guess it's not, I haven't normally seen it applied to questions of fairness. So in terms of like, if you could just go a little bit further and trying to help me understand how, the two things connect, right? So you're talking about conflict and competition, and that's the game theory, kind of framework tries to encompass that. And I suppose is what you're saying that you're trying to take into account the different interests of different players within the system, and the game theoretical model helps you to do that. So give you a little more detail about how it actually does that.
Yeah, of course. So I would say that actually within game theory, the term fairness is like a really broad term, and there are many, many fairness metrics. And that already is one interesting thing to note here, is that, of course, how we define fairness depends on the application and on the cultural context and on also the preferences of individuals. And definitely within the field of game theory, there's different like mathematical concepts that you can use to define fairness. For example, I think many people might be aware of like the Gini index for fairness. Like that measures like wealth inequality, but then there are also concepts like what we call max-min fairness, where you would say, okay, we want to make sure that the worst off, that we optimize how the worst off is affected, and afterwards how the rest of resources is distributed is a bit more free, and we more care about efficiency. And that now, with, let's say, my research, I'm trying to investigate these different fairness metrics and different approaches. Another really well-known one is the approach of a Nash equilibrium, if you more consider individuals as being selfish and optimizing selfishly. And that is like a good example if we say, well, let's say two people want to charge their EV, and both, like you and your neighbor, you want to charge your EV. And you kind of have to come up with a charging protocol that ensures that your individual needs are met in some sense, but you are connected to the grid. And let's say there's only a certain amount of power that can go through the line that connects your two houses. And then the nice thing about incorporating some of these game theoretical concepts is that we can take care of these different individual needs and then still treat individuals as self-interested and define like the level of cooperation we want. So let's say in the most extreme case, you and your neighbor, you really dislike each other and you don't want to give way or you don't want to cooperate at all. Then there is a solution concept for that situation where we say, okay, this is your objective function. Like you need to leave always at work at 5 a.m. and your neighbor needs to leave at 7 a.m. So it's better that your EV gets charged a bit earlier. But then there's also other concepts, and that's what I like, that there's this manifold of ideas. And in the end, how I see it is that us as engineers like me, I'm not the one taking the decision of which one we should choose at the end. It's more like giving options and maybe informing the public of in different applications and cultural settings, different options might be suitable. And then telling everyone about it. If you combine this metric or approach with this control theoretic algorithm, this is the outcomes that you're going to get. And these are the consequences. Do you want this or not? Do we want this as a community or not?
I guess it's something that I suppose people who get into the weeds and debating, some of the ethics of the applications of AI, because people talk about often this is like a bloodless conversation where there's no real values involved. It's just like, well, it's a machine, just works great, makes stuff better, faster, cheaper, something. But of course, embedded in all of those algorithms are a bunch of value choices about what's important. So I think you've laid out, pretty well, the mathematical kind of basis for some of these things. But I think it's, like in the realm of politics, or in Catholic social theory, you could look at the preferential option for the poor. Having been raised Catholic, it was something I remember hearing going to school, is the idea that, you design policy in such a way that you create a floor for people, minimum, standards of living, and everything else you can do the allocation later. And that's like, so we make we're in these arguments all of the time. It's just, most of us aren't as smart as you, and therefore we don't think of it as in terms of like, you could actually have a framework for, if in a world where you have to have decisions that are taken quickly, autonomously. So I know a little bit about grids, and so I know that like the speed at which decisions have to be made to keep supply and demand and balance are such that it's no longer, you can't have a lady or a guy sitting in a control room flipping switches. It has to happen at speeds that are just not something you can do without automation. And so therefore the questions about how you to make the choices embedded in the automation are really what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is also why we need like public conversation around this, and also policymakers and I would say engineers maybe have the task to do some outreach and education and explain themselves better, like through this maybe conversation, and at the same time, policymakers to draw attention to the topic and the communities getting involved. Because I think for some areas of our life, we may be okay if some private company like Google, Facebook decides how these values are embedded in the algorithms that we're using. But for, I think, these fundamental, what we were talking about, like electricity, water, traffic, like really fundamental resources that people need for daily life, especially for these ones, maybe we really wouldn't want a private company to step in and take these decisions and not inform us of what is actually happening. And and personally, I do think that automation is coming. Like many things are being automated just because of what you just said. It's too complex. Like the systems we're building, like the infrastructure systems, are so large scale. No human operator can in real time take these decisions. So rather than waiting sort of for these decisions being made for us, I do think it's a great point in time to, as a society, step in and think about what do we actually want, and which another interesting aspect is which parts of those do we actually want to be monetized or not. Like that's another entire area. Like, do we want money to be the means to ensure access to infrastructure? For example, like if you look at Europe, like there is in France, like some of the highway system is actually paid for. But you could say that these, and now in the future, there are ever more systems. Also in the US, there were these discussions I think in New York and other states to do like automated toll pricing. But these automated tolling, actually, if you do it through money, really disproportionately affects like communities with less and higher low incomes. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And it's something that's very much in the news right now in New York, as the congestion charge, as they call it there. Obviously, I'm here in the UK. In London, the congestion charge is hailed as something of a success because it's modulated, how traffic moves around the city, and kind of has decreased air pollution in certain areas. But for people who are impacted because they happen to drive for a living, or they happen to live in a community that's not well served by public transport, like they are really, really angry. So I hear people, again, I'm from New York originally, who are just absolutely furious that, they have to drive from somewhere they can't really get in, or they think they can't get in using public transport, and now they're paying $9 a day to be able to go to their hourly wage job in a hotel. And it's just, for them, they're like, I don't understand. I can't keep doing this at $9 a day. It's not going to make sense. I think it's interesting. I guess I worry that we wind up kind of, because we have to consider all these different factors, though, that we wind up either being exhausted, having to try to balance all of these different factors, and then leaving it up to the kind of tech oligarchs who happen to sit on a stage behind the president of the United States earlier this week, like, well, you did social advertising or some search advertising, so therefore, sure, you guys can run the power system, absolutely, no problem.
Yeah.
Does that worry you?
Yeah, it does. And I think it's one of these moments where I agree, like the complexity might be daunting of some of these systems. But then I think one important part is that we can take it apart and do like application per application, region per region. It doesn't have to be, we find this one approach for all infrastructure systems, all resources in Europe or in the United States. I think that's never going to work. It's more that on a local community level, and there are examples where, especially in Switzerland, so here where I live, there's like a community called Wallenstadt, and they are actually now taking action as it's a small town, and they actually have, they bought a battery system, and now they want to, in the future, become potentially an island grid, so serve their own community with electricity. They have more and more PV panels, and now they are actually working with the NCCR Automation and also ETH Zurich, where I work, together to figure out how to control this. And that is, of course, the political system in Switzerland is a direct democracy, so it's a bit different. It helps with some of this decision making and to involve citizens, but it is a good example of how this could be done in the future. And defining like the scopes is really important, and the priorities, right? We don't need to do everything at the same time, but the top like 3, okay, this is how we want to treat like different income levels. This is how we want to treat like priority access for certain groups. This is how we want to, and then breaking it down into certain structured rules and taking decisions about that.
Right. And so I think there are a couple of projects that, with some names that, some listeners might have heard of, including, one particular thing that I know you wrote that you were involved with, to maximize the amounts of computational load with green, kind of 24/7 carbon-free electricity, green, or AKA green energy. So, I mean, I don't know if what you can say about that project, but I think it's obviously something we've talked a lot about on the show, is this balance as we go into this period where electricity demand is going up, driven a lot by data centers. It's obviously a very hot topic. Can you say anything about that project?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So for the past 2 years, I worked on a research project with actually the carbon aware computing team at Google, and we developed a scheme to look into load shifting of data centers. And just to give some context of the problem, so actually at this point already, like data centers, they consume around like 5% of global electricity. But the interesting thing about this is that it's, firstly, it's quite an urgent problem because some grids due to that are being overloaded. And working on it can have high impact because this electrical load is quite flexible, especially large companies like Google. They have data centers across the entire globe, and they can, in theory, decide like how much electricity each data center consumes by routing like the jobs to different locations. And that is, the problem itself is like really challenging because normally there's a lot of uncertainty associated to, what types of compute jobs and compute requirements are going to come in the next days. And it's difficult to predict that. And at the same time, of course, a company like Google wants to keep up their high like service, has like strict service requirements for all their computing. But it is really, what motivated me to work on it and what I thought was super interesting is that the flexibility they have is like we were talking about these examples of, if Google shuts down a data center for like just 1 or 2 hours, which is often possible because many like machine learning jobs, they can be delayed in time. Like it's not a big issue if a machine learning engineer, you run a job, it finishes in 3 hours or in 4 hours or in 5 hours. But for the grid, that like 1 hour time flexibility can mean a lot. So you could have situations where you can move the load of, let's say, an entire town of 20,000 households across the country in like a couple hours. You can just say like the system operator could inform the company to be Google to say like, hey, we have a stress on the grid. like coming up tonight. Can you do something? And that is, I think, it's just massive, the impact this can have, like on the green transition, but also using more renewable energy, like transitioning towards data center locations that you use a lot of wind and solar during certain hours of the day. Yeah, so that's why I thought this project was like super interesting. And another project that I'm now gonna start working on is actually with Huawei, and they're operating, so looking into how to operate battery charging systems.
All right.
And that is actually another for the green transition to, as you probably know, like to have more storage of energy is really critical, and to make it economically attractive. That like a large battery could be an asset that a company invests into, and then managing that asset well, like when to charge and discharge this battery with, like, let's say when energy is cheap, when there's a lot of renewable energy available, and then discharging it when the grid is under strain. And that optimization is also, I think, from a theoretical point, it's super interesting, but also from an application perspective, really working with them to see what can you implement, what are the real constraints, and it kind of pushes sometimes us researchers to look at the true systems on the ground rather than making some like theoretical assumptions that maybe would never hold in practice. And I think that's cool.
I mean, I guess I'm amazed that we've gotten this far without having, your work in place that actually take some of this kind of load off. Because again, we've what I heard somebody describe, the power grid as the most complicated machine in the history of humanity. Like it's just insane the amount of things, and of course we're making it. For good reason. We're making it more complicated as opposed to these centralized hubs of like one thing I just turn on and burn something and make the thing spin and I get power. Now I got to account for weather. I got to account for, things happening across thousands of miles in different directions, and how am I going to shift, resources and electrons from one place to another. And then on the other side with demand management, figuring out like, how do I shift the compute load from one place to another or charge the EV at one time or another. So it just, the number of variables goes from like 2 to like 10 orders of magnitude more than that. So I'm amazed we've gotten this far without things falling over, actually, to be honest. I mean, has that surprised you that it's taken this long for people to be looking at, like the real hard, kind of math and engineering that you're doing, and take it as seriously as clearly people are now?
I would say, honestly, I think, okay, 2 things. I don't want to claim that in this space, I'm the first person, right? That is always a dangerous thing to say.
No, I understand.
Like, maybe it is that this type of research, there's more urgency coming up. And that's why we are getting also more attention for the work we're doing and having to deal with other types of questions, like the fairness things that really society is getting interested in, that maybe previously or control engineers, also if you're in academia, often there's a bit this tendency to look at quite theoretical setups because it's intellectually interesting, let's say. But now that some of these problems are really becoming urgent and affecting the everyday life of people, there is probably a push towards implementing some of this stuff. And I would say, though, it's not only control theory as a field that has to move, but it's like really many aspects that have to play together. And actually, I can use an example to explain this, like what I feel like is needed in the future.
Great.
So another thing that I'm looking into is like groundwater management as a problem. And one area in the US that is actually really affected by groundwater management issues is like the High Plain Aquifer, which is really vital for agriculture. But actually since measurement existed, like now in some areas of that High Plain Aquifer, the levels have decreased by over 60%. And we have, I think in just the state of Kansas, there are over 30,000 pumps and with flow meters that access the aquifer and the water and pump out water every continuously. And I think that is a great example where the flow meters are already in place, but now there needs to be a step towards policymakers. So in groundwater management per state, there are often different policies in place of what you are allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do with your well, how you can pump and pumping limits. and at the same time putting like what we call actuators, so like valves and something that can control the pumping mechanism at every pump and like constrain the limits. And then secondly, having like communication protocols, so that really allows these pumps to work together and like send information to maybe a central node that then can compute certain limits. And then what I mentioned before, like as a community of these farmers, like how do we want to set pumping limits? How do we want to, use the predictions that we have from the hydrological models? And we know that we are depleting the resource over time, which will lead to what we often call like the tragedy of the commons, because of course, if at some point there's no water available anymore, then no farmer can like irrigate their land. So that's the worst outcome for everyone, right? And how can we now, without burdening like certain communities or smaller farmers too much, still like limit overconsumption? And that, I would say it's really like multiple things that have to play together. But the technology in itself is kind of there. It just has to be put into place. We have to get the policymakers on board.
And I guess that my question, because I mean, we also just have got in the US, which I still pay attention to, despite having left there a long time ago, thank God. But looking at some of the confirmation hearings of the nominees for Energy Secretary and the Secretary of the Interior and the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, and I suppose the thing that I get to sort of really gloomy about when I hear the quality of the questions, like it's people just talking past each other who have I'm trying to keep up with you, and I don't consider myself to be a completely stupid person, but it's challenging that I hear some of these guys and ladies who are generally speaking skew a lot older, who do not come with any kind of technical or STEM kind of exposure, never mind making any kind of career in it. And you just get the sense they just have no idea what they're talking about. So you could be gentle with the policymakers and say we need to educate them and be nice and all of that. But are you? That almost sounds like a bigger problem than figuring out the algorithm. How do you actually get policymakers to pay attention to this stuff? So any tips as for people who are in our audience or in policy and advocacy who are trying to connect work like you're doing with the policy world of figuring out like you have to pay attention to this stuff because any tips about how we do that?
Well, I do think that one approach can be these community forums. I don't know if they exist that much in the US, but they do exist in like Germany and Switzerland, where really also from the community, like you force politicians to sit down with also experts and discuss the topic in an open forum, and individuals can raise their voices and say what they want. So that is, I think, an avenue sometimes that's interesting to put pressure onto politicians and policymakers. Another one is definitely I think this intersection between sometimes like research and, research communication, to put more effort into that as well. Like, how do we communicate? And that is, of course, on us researchers a little bit, and also on universities and who picks up these jobs of like just explaining what we even have developed, and also to politicians, and then make them use it and put that, and how in the end we can put that topic on their agenda. I think in democracies through political pressure, protests, it's happening ever more. But yeah, that would be my public engagement.
Well, I mean, again, I think you already tipped that the fact that you're doing this is a small contribution, and we appreciate it, your time of helping to try and connect these dots, because I do think it's important, and it's something we try to do on this show, is to try to stretch ourselves a little bit and then figure out how do we kind of collectively help tell these stories in such a way that more and more people can understand why the work that you're doing is so important. So, Sophie Hall, PhD student at ETH Zurich. I think we can leave it there. I want to give you back some time. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today on Wicked Problems.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and have a great day.
Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, I would like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon for the defense of our latest thesis. We would like to take this opportunity to set the record straight and present a new formula algorithmic in its execution.
Biochemical equation discovered by a process of elimination. Patient identifies classification or analysis. Analysts got struck by paralysis, and as of all most recent information, causality is still inconclusive. Investigation making some degree of headway through particle acceleration. Deviation is apparent in relation to the phase of rotation in the hydron, the Geiger.
If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.
On a Darwin's origin, the species about to hit the porcelain. Darkinian, reptilian, miracle compound, bar sound. You feel it when they blow up like helium, a silicon breast, or the beautiful cosmos upon its first breath. Long before solitary cell split, a monetary wealth gripped an otherwise well-equipped settlement. Intelligent enough to see the mysteries and discuss us mathematically. Algorithmic with the execution.
Tech bros. Tech bros are digital hustlers who have artificial intelligence. These AI-driven, blockchain-enabled datasets are confined to their WeWork cubicles, sinking into a beanbag in the communal area, drinking a nitro brew, while updating their Instagram bio to say, explorer/dreamer/founder, building the future for a better tomorrow. All opinions are my own and don't reflect that of my employer. Tech bros are polyamorous and they're afraid of commitment, which means they have 3 side projects on the go at any time that they'll never complete. After the Q1 Sigma grind set grows static, their passion projects turn passive, and they have to clear their head with a work trip to Dubai to attend a tech conference / pay a mid-tier influencer to control Alt-Delete all over their chest. Tech bros see themselves as industry disruptors. They disrupt the industry of their organisation with disorderly conduct. Day drinking at their desk at 3 p.m, getting handsy in the workplace, and picking a fight with the intern in one of the breakout rooms after snorting too many lines of code. These productivity-conscious body hackers complain about the lack of off-site facilities in their company, yet are completely unaware that they're the very reason the Christmas party is only 3 hours long and is hosted in the canteen. Tech bros are minimalists. They sleep for 2 hours a day and spend the rest of their time off watching productivity hacks, running off the fumes of a techno-utopian hype cult that doesn't pay its staff a salary because it's still stuck in seed stage. So the revolution will not be televised, but the television will be revolutionized via a generative AI app that turns your sweat particles into digital pixels that resembles the basement level of a startup that lacks human rights. No one outside Google wants to be in my video. It's almost as if they have something to hide. Tech bros are edgelord libertarians who have a community fetish. Solving social issues with apps is their love language. Plastering a digital band-aid on a bleeding heart. They clean up open source with open source. Leveraging AI to revolutionise things that used to be charitable, like fundraising. The appification of everyday life strips us of the social, turning everything into a transaction until all that's left are crowd-funded funerals, algorithmic parenting, and activism, now available in tiers. Basic gets you to the picket line, and for just a small subscription fee, you can download Premium to unlock bonus chants, slogans, and a photo op with a megaphone to post all over your social media like you're a good person. The growth pipeline of the tech bro goes from flaccid to erect seconds after their startup starts scaling, edging to completion at the thought of unregulated market competition, scraping your data and spluttering out side hustles while liking all of Elon Musk's tweets, who they think is decidedly not a Nazi.
What?
No, sorry, thank you. With no more social issues to conquer, the only problem left for tech bros to solve is the problem of ethics. Tech bros care deeply about the ethics of AI, which is just another way of asking, how evil can we get without anyone noticing it? So rather than making AI more ethical, they just talk about wanting to make AI more ethical, which is basically the same thing as long as you're not affected by it. So what do you do in tech?
We make machines that make DNA. Our goal is to increase creativity for all humans, so scientists can live out of their bedroom and do experiments right from there.
Oh. Tech bros think they're on the cusp of an AI revolution that will help build communities, when really, they're just building machines that will disrupt the retail industry, de-skill the workers, and take jobs off poor people. But thankfully, these digital natives are building an app that will disrupt the homelessness industry too. So pretty soon, you'll be able to donate a virtual NFT tent to an unhoused ex-Tesco employee in the metaverse. Tech bros, forever the champions of social justice, are future-proofing scalable growth spurts, undermining public values and exploiting the labour of underpaid workers that they outsource from the global south. And they're doing all this because they love you. Can you hold this? Can you hold this?